Our topic tonight is the origin of coal and oil. I'm hoping that it will be a help to you and informative and as easy to understand as possible. You all know what coal is, of course, don't you? It's a readily combustible rock containing 50% by weight and 70% by volume of carbonaceous material. That's carbon-rich material that's formed by the compaction and induration, that's the pressing and hardening of various altered plant remains, similar to those in peat. Well, that's what the definition says. But I want to show you tonight that coal is definitely not come from peat. And you'll quickly learn that. But that's the dictionary definition, the geological dictionary. So coal is found in beds called seams within thick, extensive sequences of marine fossil-bearing sedimentary layers. And that's very important because most people don't realise that marine fossils are prolific where you find coal beds. You even find marine fossils sometimes within coal beds. And that's significant. Why? Because during the flood, the ocean waters flooded over the continents. And most fossils are marine fossils, and we find the marine fossils buried on the continents, not in the oceans, on the continents. So that's clue number one. And when these coal beds are thick, they're followed some distance and mined, either with open pit mines like this one here with big diggers, or deep underground. And of course, people have been digging coal now for several centuries. In the United States, there's at least 250 billion tonnes of recoverable coal reserves. In fact, the total amount of coal is estimated to be over 7 trillion tonnes. That's a lot of plant material, by the way, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Global output in 2011 was nearly 8 billion tonnes. And there's a lot of coal mining in Australia, in South Africa, Canada, of course here in the United States as well, and parts of Europe and India. Well, coal comes in a number of forms. We call them ranks, different ranks. It's to do with the degree of compaction and the amount of carbon. And so you have brown coal or lignite is not as combustible, it has less carbon, it has more water in it. Then you go to a subbituminous coal and a high volatile bituminous coal, and finally anthracite, which is very high in carbon and very easily burnt. Well, let's go back to our definition. Coal is supposed to be, according to the dictionary definition, a carbonaceous material formed from compaction and induration of variously altered plant remains similar to those in peat. Well, what is a peat? Let's explore that. Peat is an unconsolidated deposit of semi-carbonised plant remains in a water-saturated environment such as a bog or a swamp. And of course, the dictionary says it's an early stage in the development of coal, which it isn't, as you'll find out tonight. Structures of vegetal matter may or may not be seen depending on the degree of organic matter degradation. Well, let's explore this a bit further. Evolutionary geologists insist that coal beds formed from peat that accumulated very slowly in vast swamps. And they maintain that each foot of coal may have required up to 10 feet of peat to have accumulated and then be compacted by the deposition of the overlying sedimentary layers. So that's a lot of plant material to build up 10 feet of peat, which is then buried, compressed and hardened to form 1 foot of coal. And so they claim these vast coal swamps supposedly existed for millions of years, with the peat accumulating over countless thousands to millions of years. Well, let's have a look at a peat swamp. This is the conventional idea of a peat swamp. Some strange looking plants there that you don't see today because the plant fossils found in coal are different from many of the plants we see today. That's supposed to be the textbook image of what a coal peat swamp may have looked like. What about a peat swamp today? Here's a drained peat swamp on the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. What is the one thing you can see sticking out of that peat? Roots. You're all very observant. I've got your attention. Now, keep that in mind and we'll come back to it. So, is peat the origin of coal? That's the important question to ask. Well, you've already observed that peat contains the roots of all sizes of plants that grew in the swamp. And all the vegetable matter is rotted down to a homogeneous, not structured mixture that has the texture of mashed potatoes and looks a little like spent coffee grounds. So, if that's what a peat looks like, remember it has roots, it's homogenized, it looks like coffee grounds. What do coal beds look like? Notice coal beds contain no roots of any size, and they are structured with lots of evidence of lots of preserved tree bark, wood, twigs, and even leaves. So what do you find in peat? Roots, no bark, no wood, no twigs, no leaves. So can peat be the origin of coal? No. Thus, if the present is the key to the past, then peat cannot be the origin of coal. I mean, simple observation. Yet they can't see it. The evidence is staring them in the face. Why? Because their idea about the formation of coal is driven by their belief system in the millions of years. So, do we know of circumstances in the present which may be clues to how coal formed in the past? The answer is yes, we do. Mount St Helens in 1980 erupted, and the top 1,300 feet of the mountain was blasted away. And as a consequence, what happened? Well, here it is. The first stage was that the blast went out sideways, simply because the mountain was weakened on the north face, and the pressure built up, and it blew out sideways. Eventually it went vertical, but in the initial blast it went sideways, and it engulfed the surrounding forests, and it stripped the trees. This was when it went vertical after the first initial blast. In fact, for 9 hours it was belching out enormous amounts of energy in volcanic ash explosions. But this was the devastation of the countryside as a result of that 9-hour eruption. Everything was stripped bare from the surrounding forests. Trees were picked up like matchsticks, stripped of their leaves and branches, and tossed around in every which way. Now, many of these logs ended up in the waters of Spirit Lake. And it's hard to see in this photograph, but in the shadows, there is a log mat. There's a mat of logs in there, and I'll show you some better photographs in a moment. And this is the map. You can see Mount St Helens here, the volcanic cone. The blast went northwards. The Spirit Lake is sitting right there. And the forests were all devastated in this surrounding area. As the side of the volcano slid into nearby Spirit Lake, it pushed a wave of water into the neighbouring forest, up to 800 feet up the sides of the mountain, and dragging the logs down into the lake. By afternoon, over 1 million logs were floating on the lake. Many were actually floating upright. Even though the roots were broken off, the bases, because the base is still thicker and heavier, and therefore it's denser, so the logs, as they become waterlogged, tend to float upright. Here we have a closer view in better light. Here's the log mat floating on Spirit Lake, and we can see one here standing vertical and more here. These upright floating logs. That just happened as a result of the thickness of those logs being thicker at one end, and therefore when they're waterlogged, they're heavier, and so the log sinks and floats vertically. The enormous log mat floating on Spirit Lake lost its bark and branches, rubbed off by the abrasive action of wind and waves as the wind jostled these around. So scuba divers investigated the lake bottom. And what did they find? They found sheets of bark intermingled with volcanic sediments and had formed a layer of peat on the bottom of the lake more than 3 feet thick. So here we have the scuba divers, see them there in the foreground. Pretty dangerous when you've got an active volcano right behind you. And down they went, and here's one of their photographs. You can see here a big sheet of tree bark and other debris on the bottom here. This is building up as a layer of organic debris that is a form of peat. Together with broken branches and woody materials, the sheets of bark gave this peat a coarse texture and a layered appearance, and it resembled, both compositionally and texturally, what certain coal beds in the eastern United States look like. Here again, remind you, coal beds contain no roots. They're structured with lots of evidence of bark, wood, twigs, and even leaves. The Spirit Lake peat accumulated in just 5 years. And as I said, it's texturally and compositionally similar to the coarse contents of many coal beds. Now, as we said before, many geologists claim that coal beds formed by very slow accumulation of organic material in vast swamps where the plants grew in place. And they usually say it takes about 1,000 years to form every inch of coal. That's how much growth you need of plant material according to their slow and gradual hypothesis. However, the texture of coal, as we've seen, doesn't match what we find in a typical swamp peat today, which, as we saw, is very fine with a texture looking like coffee grounds or mashed potatoes. And of course, the roots of the plants growing in the swamps break up the bark. As the plants are growing in the swamps, they're churning up material and making it homogeneous. The bark is rotting down, and so all you get left is the root material. And there it is again. Totally different to what you see on the bottom of Spirit Lake, totally different to what you see in coal beds. The lesson from Spirit Lake is that coal beds can and do form rapidly due to catastrophic destruction of forests and not by the slow and gradual growth of plants in swamps. We need to remember that the flood would have destroyed all the forests on the pre-flood land surface, and the floating logs would have jostled around on the flood waters for a matter of weeks and breaking off the bark and the twigs, and all that debris would eventually have been swept into and settled into beds to form the coal beds. There may also have been vast floating forests forming a unique biological community of plants and other large areas over large areas of the pre-flood ocean surface. Why do I say that? Well, many of the plants found in the coal beds were hollow, with hollow roots. Hollow roots can't penetrate and grow in a soil. It's been shown that these plants would have grown floating on water, just like we have quaking bogs today, plants that grow only in water. And with intertwined roots, these trees side by side with intertwined roots would form a mat of debris that fell down, of leaves and that over the time between creation and the flood. And these floating forests may well have been on the pre-flood ocean surface. And we've depicted that in the flood geology room here in the museum. And we've actually mentioned this in our Answers magazine in articles, that this may have been one of those biological communities that was destroyed by the flood, and because it took a while to sweep it up onto the land, it was buried after some of the marine fossils that were buried early in the flood. And that diagram depicts that. The vertical order of rock layers and fossils in them reflects the horizontal spread of the different biological communities that were progressively overwhelmed as the flood waters swept up onto the continents, the pre-flood continent. And so there could well have been this floating mat of forest and debris that would drop the material just like it was dropped on the floor of Spirit Lake as a result of the floating log mat on Spirit Lake that developed a peat there on the ocean floor, on the lake shore. Now, there's another clue here. Many logs subsequently sank to the floor of the lake, still upright but rootless. In other words, they didn't grow at the bottom of the lake. They grew elsewhere but were deposited upright at the bottom of the lake. It was estimated that 20,000 upright, fully submerged logs were sitting on the floor of the lake by August 1985. That's 5 years after the eruption. They looked like a forest of trees buried in the mud. So again, with sonar, radar investigation and scuba divers going down, they found that many logs had become buried by more than 3 feet of sediment while others were still resting on the floor of the lake. So here's our scuba divers again. Down they go, and that's looking up back to the surface. You can see all the logs there jostling around on the water surface. We go down, and here we can actually see the base of a huge tree here, a tree stump. You can see where the roots were, and they've been broken off. And this is the sonar picture. Each of those shadows represents a vertical log. And this is the lake floor down here. And these are the sediments bearing the logs. So in cartoon style, that's what it would have looked like. It looked like in Spirit Lake. See the logs there buried upright? There have been many layers of volcanic sediment have taken to bury them. Now, you can imagine if further volcanic eruptions occurred at Mount St. Helens and more sediment was buried, was washed into the lake, as more logs sank, what would you get? You'd get a cycle of progressive burial of layers with upright floating logs, where the roots were broken off would be at different levels in different volcanic layers. And that's significant because we actually observe a situation where we see that today in the fossil record. Now, in just 5 years, many layers of upright trees were buried. If geologists had never observed what actually happened, they could easily have misinterpreted these upright buried logs as representing multiple forests that grew at different periods over many thousands of years. But we actually observed what happened here. The tragedy is that you can go to Yellowstone National Park and you find there upright petrified logs at Specimen Ridge in the northern part of Yellowstone National Park, and these have been interpreted as successive forests that grew over thousands of years. Yet, these petrified logs are missing their bark and they're missing their roots. So how could they have grown there if they don't have their roots still there? And yet, what we saw at Mount St. Helens, and this Specimen Ridge, has many of these layers of volcanic rock with these petrified trees at different levels. And yet, what we saw at Spirit Lake perfectly explains these fossilised upright logs in so-called petrified forests. All they were logs that were floating during the flood and sank to be buried upright in the flood sediments as the sediments rapidly accumulated. Now, why is this significant? Because we see similar situations associated with many coal beds. And that's exactly what we saw at Mount St. Helens. Remember, we saw the peat on the bottom of Spirit Lake, and we also saw these upright fossilised trees that didn't grow there. And in the fossil record, we find what are called polystrate fossils. Poly means many, straight means strata. These are fossils, and in the case we're going to look at in a moment, logs that are upright, buried by multiple sedimentary layers. And these, therefore, also had to be buried in the catastrophe, just like the ones at Spirit Lake were buried in the catastrophe at Mount St. Helens. So if we go to Eastern Australia, in the Sydney Basin, you have large coal beds. And this is north of Sydney. You can see Sydney there. And Newcastle is to the north. And there are many coal beds with other sedimentary and volcanic layers between them. And we find upright fossilised logs are commonly associated with these coal beds. And these logs have their roots broken off and they require many layers to bury them. Here's an example. Here's the one coal bed here, the bottom part of the screen. Here we can see two of these fossilised trees that are in upright position. And this is the local geologic diagram. That's that coal bed down the bottom there. Here's one of these tree stumps. There's 4 units of volcanic ash beds, and then there's another coal bed up above it. Well, the interesting thing is that we zoom out and we get the bigger picture here. We can see the lower coal bed, the upper coal bed. We can see the volcanic ash beds in between. Here's one of these trees I showed you a moment ago. There's the other one. Well, this one over here, we know that when it was first found, we have eyewitness testimony that when this was found, it went all the way from the bottom coal bed all the way through the top coal bed. That's interesting, isn't it? Remember, this is supposed to be a swamp, but this tree couldn't have grown there because it didn't have roots. And by the way, it's a type of tree that doesn't grow in swamps. It's a pine tree. These polystrate tree fossils didn't grow in any swamp that produced the lowest seam over many thousands of years, as they are rootless. And they're pine trees that don't grow in swamps. And how could they have survived without rotting through thousands of years of volcanic eruptions and then thousands of years of another peat swamp? After all, these tree stumps went all the way through the top coal bed. And if that represents thousands of years of a swamp, wouldn't the tree have rotted? Wouldn't it have got burnt and destroyed by the volcanic eruptions if it wasn't buried and all happened very quickly and accumulated very rapidly? So these tree stumps were violently and rapidly buried before they could rot, which means the plant debris which formed the coal seams was also rapidly and violently deposited and buried. You know, that top coal seam, that had to be so rapid that it did accumulating all that vegetal matter that the tree sticking up there, the tree stump sticking up there didn't rot away. But these are not isolated examples. Many coal beds in many other places around the world have similar polystrate tree stumps associated with them. So we go to Canada, Joggins, Nova Scotia. We go to the Ruhr district of Germany. We go to the Appalachian coal beds of Tennessee and West Virginia. We see the same story, the same sort of trees. And so there are other examples in many parts of the world. Some of these trees were, when they were found, 150 feet long. Some of them standing vertically, some inclined, and sometimes between and through successive coal beds. I know of an example that was found in the 1840s and 1850s in Britain, where the testimony is it went all the way from one coal bed through another coal bed above it, over 150 feet long. I've had the same testimony from a coal miner in the Newcastle area in Eastern Australia, where one of these tree stumps went from one coal bed right through, up through another coal bed. Examples in eastern Canada and also here in the eastern United States. Not only do we have that problem, but we also find in many parts of the world, this is an example in Germany, where coal beds split and join other coal beds. I mean, swamps don't behave like that. That has to be due to the rapid accumulation, the way the water currents were carrying the vegetal material and how it settled, as to how it could split and reform layers and join other coal beds. And it had to be very rapid and very violent. As I said before, coal seams do not contain roots, but lots of bark, wood and leaves, unlike swamps, which have lots of roots. Coal seams also contain clays from decomposed volcanic ash, and coal beds are often associated with volcanic ash beds, whereas swamp peats do not contain clays at all. And that's why, for example, in Ireland, they can drain the peat swamp and dry the peat and burn it because there's no clay in there. It's all organic material that's burnable. Associated rootless polystrate tree stumps are also evidence that the vegetation across the pre-flood land surface was rapidly destroyed and buried. Well, how long does it take to form coal? Now, we've buried the plant material, but now we've got to turn it into that hard black stuff that we can dig up and burn in power stations like the one just across the river from us here tonight. Well, numerous experiments have demonstrated that plant debris and wood can be converted to coal within hours to months. Two early experiments involved the rapid application of vibrating pressures and intense heat to wood, and that produced artificial coal within hours. I've heard of examples where, they used to get the wood logs and drive them into the ground to build the pylons for bridges and jetties off the coast. Well, that vibrating pressure has turned the log at the bottom, can turn it into coal. That's been witnessed. But these are not the best experiments to simulate natural conditions. The best experiments I know of were done over 30 years ago in the Argonne National Laboratories in Illinois. And what they tried to do is they took wood and they heated it to 150 degrees. Now, you might think that's hot. It is. That's 100 degrees is the boiling point of water. That's degrees Celsius. So 150 is 1.5 times the boiling point of water. That's cool geologically, by the way, because those lavas you see flowing out of the Hawaiian volcanoes, they're over 1,200 degrees C. That's hot geologically. So wood with water in the presence of montmorillonite or illite, which are clay minerals. And those clay minerals they found acted like catalysts. And they were able to convert the wood to simple coal in a period from 2 weeks to a year. Here's a table of some of their experiments. 150 degrees experiments from 2 years to 8 months. 2 months to 8 months, depending on the conditions that they used. And here in run number 3, they made sure that the clay was acidic, which is significant because volcanic waters are acidic from the sulfur. And so they simulated acidic clay, and the acidic clay sped up the process, halved the time down to only 28 days to get a good quality simple coal. So softwood heated with clays at 150 degrees was rapidly able to transform these woody materials into coals of various ranks. The longer reaction times produced materials resembling the major component in coal called vitrinite. Vitrinite is the shinier black material that you see in coal. It comes from vitreous, like vitreous porcelain. It gives that kind of luster, and so it's called vitrinite. And they used other clay minerals and produced similar results. So here's the data plotted on this diagram. It's very simple. It's the oxygen versus the hydrogen in reference to the carbon. And they started here with number 1 is the 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 8 months. And you can see the results follow the curve of natural vitrinite. The higher the rank as you go down, because you get more carbon and less hydrogen and oxygen as a result of the maturing of the material and its compaction. So in the presence of clay activated by acid, the reaction of wood, lignin, to form coal materials was highly accelerated, even at 150 degrees C, 4 weeks instead of 2 months. They found that the catalytic action of clays occurred when the reaction was carried out in the presence of air, which is important. It means you don't need deep burial. It can virtually happen at the Earth's surface. And that's interesting because you see coal beds where you get dinosaur footprints. So the material had turned to coal even before it was buried, and the dinosaurs could walk across the material. This combination of clays and acidic water is significant because volcanic-derived clays are common in and adjacent to coal beds. In coal beds or seams, clays are present as partial or complete infillings of the plant cell cavities, particularly in the major component vitrinite, and it's also found as thin layers. As I said before, in contrast, clays are rarely present in modern peat swamps. Now we know from the geologic record that extensive volcanic ash beds are associated with coal beds, and we know that there are extensive, massive explosive eruptions, volcanic eruptions during the flood. In fact, the volume and extent of some of the volcanic rocks in the geologic record make volcanic eruptions today look like firecrackers. A third of the Indian subcontinent is covered in basalts 1,000 feet deep. Huge eruptions during the flood. We need to remember that 70% of volcanic eruptions is hot water and steam, which is usually acidic because of the sulfur associated with the volcanic eruptions. And that resulting acidic hot water rapidly alters volcanic ash to clay. And the temperatures would easily be up to 150 degrees under those conditions, but not over 150 degrees because the clay minerals are metamorphosed or changed if the temperatures get too high. So this combination fits the catastrophic conditions during the flood when explosive volcanic activity was occurring to contribute to the rapid burial of layers of plant debris and accompanying volcanic ash. And within months of burial, the plant debris was rapidly transformed into coal by the acidic hot water acting on the volcanic ash-derived clays mixed with the plant debris. So only months were required, not millions of years. Now, one final question that often comes up. Were there enough plants to form all today's coal? I mean, we've got 7 trillion tonnes of coal in the United States alone. And it is claimed, as I said before, that up to 10 feet of plant debris is needed to compact down to make 1 foot thickness of coal. That's a compaction ratio of 10 to 1. Today, our planet is only 30% covered in land and 50% is sparsely vegetated or desert. And there's no vegetation on the ocean surface. So, if we looked at the vegetation today on the Earth's surface, it only amounts to about 3% of the vegetation that's buried in the coal. So, our opponents say there never could have been enough vegetation to have grown all at once, that is in the pre-flood world, to form all of today's coal beds. Well, they failed to do their homework. First of all, observational evidence shows that the compaction ratio was closer to 1 to 1. Remember I said you get marine fossils sometimes in coal beds? Sometimes you get these balls of limestone. They call them coal balls, but they're actually balls of limestone. You break open the ball of limestone and you've got marine fossils, and it's buried there in the coal bed. How could that be in a swamp? We don't find that in a swamp. And as I said before, we find dinosaur footprints. I've been to coal beds and mines in just west of Brisbane in Australia, where I lived on the east coast of Australia for many years. And where they've mined out the coal, you can still see the footprints of the dinosaurs that actually walked on the coal. And from the amount of compaction in those footprints, we can show that the plant material didn't need to compact 10 to 1. It was closer to a 1 to 1 compaction. So that means that we only need 10%, not 100% of the vegetation. If you want 10 to 1, we've reduced it now by that fraction. We've reduced it by 90%, the amount of vegetation we need. Then according to the biblical model of Earth history, probably 50% of the Earth's pre-flood surface was a supercontinent, all covered in lush vegetation. Not half, all. In other words, there weren't deserts like we have today. And then remember I talked about that pre-flood floating forest? Up to 50% of the pre-flood ocean surface was properly covered by these floating forests. So 75% of the Earth's surface may have been covered in vegetation prior to the flood. And that doesn't surprise me because compared to the present oceans, think about the corals and clams that we find on the seashores today. 95% of the fossil record by volume and number are those kinds of fossils. Compared to what the pre-flood world must have looked like with the huge volume of those fossils that we find in the fossil record, the oceans today are a desert by comparison. That's how rich the life was. So if we do this math, and this diagram comes out of our Answers magazine. I wrote an article, it's on our website. Just go to our website and ask the question in the search engine and you'll get the article with this diagram, which does the comparison between the conventional idea of a 10 to 1 compaction ratio and what the vegetation was like on the present Earth's surface compared with what we believe it was prior to the flood. And we can fully account for enough vegetation to have been growing on the pre-flood world all at once to be swept away, rapidly buried, transformed by heat and clays from the buried plant debris into coal. So, let's sum this up. Pre-flood land vegetation and forests floating on the ocean surface were progressively and catastrophically destroyed and then buried rapidly in sedimentary layer sequences with volcanic ash, sometimes with vertical, rootless, polystrate tree stumps. Increasing temperatures with deeper burial and hot groundwaters and acidic volcanic waters turned the volcanic ash to clay, which catalysed the rapid transformation of the beds of plant debris into the coal beds we see today, all within months. Okay, what is oil? And we haven't run out yet, and we're not likely to in the foreseeable future. Oil or petroleum is a natural occurring complex liquid hydrocarbon which after distillation and removal of impurities yields a range of combustible fuels, petrochemicals and lubricants. We all know that oil flows or is pumped from wells drilled into sedimentary reservoir rocks that host the hydrocarbons often deep below the surface. The hydrocarbons are in host porous reservoir sedimentary layers that are trapped in structures that are capped by impervious sedimentary layers. What do I mean by that? Well, this yellow rock is porous, so the hydrocarbons are able to move along this yellow rock, but where you've got this bend up here, this dark rock is impervious. So it can't keep flowing upwards, it's trapped. And so that's what the geophysicists and geologists are looking for. And when they find one of these traps where the oil's accumulated, we can drill down and pump the oil out. And that's how it works. Crude oil is found in many parts of the world. The largest reserves are in Saudi Arabia, which is why they control the oil market, and Venezuela, and the oil price, I might add. And the reserves are in many types. You've got conventional oils that you use for gas, for driving cars, heavy oils for industrial purposes or extra heavy oils, and then there's the oil sands and bitumen. A lot of that's up in Canada, for example, the Athabasca tar sands. And here are the countries that have oil. Interesting, Brazil, just a decade or so ago, found a huge oil field off its coast, and it jumped into the big league overnight as a result of that, just that one find. But you can see the blue countries, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, are part of OPEC that control the oil market. Okay, we often get asked, can hydrocarbons be produced abiotically, that is, from non-biologic sources? And the answer is yes, by heat being applied to carbonate-bearing rocks, say limestone. If you apply heat to a limestone, you'll produce methane from it, which is one of the hydrocarbons that is in oil, and well, particularly in natural gas. But on the other side of the coin, the answer is no. Why? Because we can verify that most oil does not form in that manner. And there's a good reason. How do we know that most oil is of biotic origin from biologic sources? Because of the composition of the oils. Abiotic hydrocarbons, that is from non-biologic sources, have a different composition to the oils and petroleums of the majority that we find. Most oils contain chemical markers called porphyrins that are found only in plants and algae. So let's explode the myth that when you load up your tank with your gas tank with fuel to drive your car, you do not have your grandmother, your great-great-great-grandmother in your crankcase. Some people have got this idea that all the pre-flood humans and animals got swept away and they turned to oil, and therefore we're putting our ancestors into our fuel tanks. No, we're not. It's primarily plants and algae. You don't believe me? I've heard that said. Some people have made that sort of comment. Well, it's not true. For oil to form requires a source rock which contains buried in it organic remains of plants, especially algae. So, for example, in eastern Ohio, we have a shale, which is a mud rock, that's got a lot of organic matter in it. It's not easy to form oil from it, but I tell you what, if you drill in it and frack it, you actually get oil produced from it. And so that's what the fracking is all about, producing oil from dispersed organic matter in host rocks like shales or mud rocks. Increasing heat causes the organic matter to break down and release the liquid and gaseous hydrocarbons in it. But the source rock also needs to be permeable. What do I mean by that? It needs to have pores in it that are interconnected. So that if it's interconnected, that means the fluids can flow and they can be squeezed out of the source rock, because we want them to flow so that they eventually get trapped in a reservoir rock so they can pond and accumulate. You might have a dispersed amount of hydrocarbon in a rock, which is what we find in these shales in eastern Ohio. And by fracking, we're encouraging it. We're breaking the rock up so the hydrocarbons can flow and be pumped out. Well, we want that to happen naturally in a normal situation. And so here we have this oil has come from another area where it's a source rock. It's been able to flow through the pores of the source rock up into this reservoir rock. And again, this is another way you can get a trap. It meets an impermeable rock that traps it there in that structure. There are two forms in which plant organic matter can and has accumulated in sedimentary rocks. I've already indicated these. First of all, it's coal beds. And secondly, as plant matter that's dispersed, such as algae, in shales or mudstones, limestones, and other rocks. Much of the oil in Saudi Arabia comes from limestones with organic matter in them. The principal sources of heat are due to deep burial, nearby volcanism, and hot fluids. We have a technical term. We like to confuse people. We talk about hydrothermal fluids. But really, I'll translate that. Hydro is water, thermal is hot. So they're hot waters. That's the layman's translation. There is both observational and abundant experimental evidence for the rapid formation of oil from coal and or from buried plant organic matter by heat and hot water. And we've already seen how plant organic matter would have been buried rapidly to form coal beds during the flood, and also that it was dispersed rapidly in other sedimentary rocks. So all we need to do now is show you examples of the formation of oil and hydrocarbons by rapid processes. So let me give you some examples. Again, I'm biased. I go back to Australia, but this is an excellent example. Why? Because Lewis Weeks of Esso at the time came to Australia and gave an advice to a mining company called BHP about oil, where to find oil in Australia. And he looked at the coal beds of the Gippsland Basin onshore. There are very thick brown coal beds. And the evidence indicated that these coal beds went down off the coast here in southeastern Australia, down under the ocean where they were buried deeply. And he said, oil comes from coal, therefore I suggest you look offshore. And we did. We went offshore and drilled in the 1960s and discovered all this oil and natural gas. And it was based on this simple knowledge that oil comes from coal. And so here's the rock unit, the Latrobe Group. Onshore, the coal seams are lignite or thick brown coals that are mined in huge open pits. And the coal seams are buried deeper as the rock layers dip down under Bass Strait, where they've been heated. And as a consequence, we've got all these offshore natural gas and oil traps, oil fields. And so you can see here the depth of burial, 2,000, 3,000 metres. That's 10,000 feet of burial. And so as a consequence, they drilled, and sure enough, they found that they did the geophysical surveys, found the structural and other traps, and they found these oil and gas fields. And Australia almost had independence of the international market for many years for oil. What they found was if you go from the coast, you'll get gas close to the coast, and as you go further deeper, you get more gas, and then you get gas and oil, and finally you just get oil. The depth of the coal increases, the rank of the coal increases from brown to black. And so It's a very well-known relationship. In fact, at the greatest depth of burial, you only get methane generation down here. There's a particular window which is called the oil generation window. It's already been figured out. Geologists know to go to a sedimentary basin, and if you find that the plant material has been buried to a certain depth with a particular characteristics, that the oil will have been generated from that material. That's why they know to go look for oil in some sedimentary basins and not others. This window is characterised by a precise range in the vitrinite reflectance. That is, you shine a light onto that shiny vitreous mineral or material in the coal, and the amount of light that bounces back gives you an idea of the degree of the maturity of the coal. And it's at a particular range of maturity that we know the oil will be generated from the coal. And the interesting thing is, because these sediments are still sinking and these conditions are still going on, some of these oil reservoirs are refilling as they're being pumped, the material's being pumped out. And I believe it's the same here in the US, but no one has really done the research to show that. Why? Because they're not asking that question. They believe in millions of years, so they're not thinking that these processes have only taken thousands of years and could still be going on today. So you see, when you start from a biblical perspective, you have a totally different research agenda asking totally different questions. And that's why the conventional scientific community can miss out on discoveries that we can make because we're asking different questions. Well, the conclusion that the oil and gas has been generated from the brown coal beds by heat of deeper burial under Bass Strait has actually been verified. They actually did experiments. Scientists from our government agency did the experiments. They knew that the coal beds are below the oil and gas reservoirs have vitrinite reflectance values in the correct range for the oil and gas to have been generated from them by the heat of burial boiling off. That's what it is. You know, the plant material has waxes and resins and saps in it, doesn't it? And that's all it is. It's trapped in the coal, and you have just to heat it up enough that those waxes and resins bubble off, and that forms your oil. And at the same time as that process is happening, the coal is becoming blacker. It's going from brown to black. And so they looked and they found, yes, there was a linear relationship of increasing reflectance in the vitrinite through depth of burial. It absolutely fitted the model that the coal seams, as they were buried deeper under Bass Strait, had changed from brown to black coal, and the oil was generated as a result of that increased depth of burial. So the next question was, how fast does it form? How quickly would this oil and gas be generated? So they did a series of experiments. It was very easy to do. What did they do? They took 6 samples of the brown coal. They took 6 stainless steel tubes, sealed the coal in the stainless steel tubes, placed them vertically in an oven, which was heated to 100 degrees C. And then what did they do? Every week they turned up the knob on the oven by 1 degree. So after a year, the temperature had gone up to 150 degrees. After 2 years, 100 degrees. 3 years, 150. 4 years, 2. And so they went on for 6 years. And after each year, they opened the oven, took out one of those tubes, and then kept on heating the other ones so they could compare the results at 150 degrees after 1 year, 200 degrees after 2 years, 250. You get the picture? And so after the end of each year, as one tube was taken out, they opened it up to analyse the coal and whether there was any gas or oil present. And guess what? As they went through this 6-year period, we started with brown coal up here, and down here we had black coal after 6 years. We'd driven off all the water out of the system, and not only that, the vitrinite reflectance had increased. And what did we find? These coals plotted exactly along the line at which we find natural vitrinites in different coal beds would fit. So they realised that they had simulated this conversion of brown coal to black coal in just 6 years. But there's more. What about the oil and gas generated? In the first 100 weeks, only carbon dioxide was produced. But between 3 and 4 years, between 250 and 300 degrees C, the coal generated 0.2% oil, which is identical to the natural crude oils that were pumping out of the oil fields. After 5 years, the product resembled carbon dioxide-rich natural gas, similar to what they were getting out of the gas fields. So it was concluded that heating times of only several years to only 300 degrees C are sufficient to generate the natural equivalent oil and gas from coal precursors. The molecular mechanism of the decomposition process is little changed by any additional time, meaning millions of years are not required. In fact, millions of years will spoil the whole process, will spoil the recipe. And flooding of the reservoir with migrating hydrocarbons is more likely to fill a reservoir than a slow accumulation over a long geologic period. This was actually the write-up in their scientific report. By the way, don't be afraid of it taking a few years. Remember, if this material was buried during the flood, we've had plenty of time since the flood to produce the oil. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But could these laboratory experiments really have simulated natural formation of petroleum for organic matter in source rocks in less than 6 years? Yes. We have it happening before our very eyes naturally off the coast of Mexico in the Guaymas Basin in the Gulf of California, where the ocean floor is rifted, there's cracks in the ocean floor, hot water is bubbling up, hydrothermal fluids, through organic rich sediments, and it's rapidly producing natural petroleum. We've gone down there and sampled it. Here it is. Here's the Guaymas Basin in the Gulf of California off the coast of Mexico. And what we've found is that the bubbles coming up have got globules of oil in them. Now, they're not being trapped, they're just being dispersed into the water column in the ocean above. There's no trapping it, it just dissipates, so there's no accumulation and preservation of the oil. And whereas oil was thought to require millions of years to form, here it's observed to form within less than 4,000 years. That's, of course, if you believe the radiocarbon dating, which I know isn't accurate. So you're only talking about short time scales. Even they have admitted that. The boiling water at greater than 200 degrees C is rapidly breaking down the organic matter in the sediments to produce gas and discrete globules of oil that is similar to typical reservoir crude oils. In fact, even with the correct gas-oil ratio of 5:1. And the organic matter in these sediments is predominantly bacteria and algae, just as we find buried and fossilised in the source rocks for many oil fields. And here was their table with the analysis of these oils that they produced. That was very similar to regular oils from other parts of the world. These observations suggest that contrary to uniformitarianism, that is slow and gradual over millions of years dogma, natural petroleum formation could have been rapid. This multi-step process in which their multi-step process, that's the millions of years process, in which organic matter undergoes successive alteration before generating oil, which subsequently migrates to be trapped in suitable reservoir rocks and structures, it has very low efficiency and converts to oil only a minor fraction of the organic matter in the sediments. But under rapid hydrothermal conditions, hot water conditions, oil generation rapidly provides a demonstrated efficient single-step process. That's exactly what we're observing in the Guaymas Basin off the coast of Mexico. A single-step process capable of producing oil equivalent to typical reservoir crude oils. So the hydrothermal fluids generated by volcanic heat, if it percolates through deeply buried organic rich sediment layers in a sedimentary basin, i.e. after they've been deposited during the flood, would produce oil rapidly, which would then migrate rapidly into suitable traps. And so we can imagine a closed sedimentary basin, which is what's happening in the flood as sediments accumulating rapid. They're quickly capping off those source rocks so that the heat generating oil doesn't allow the oil to dissipate. It's trapped and ponds and accumulates. And so the oil accumulates and can be preserved. In fact, friends of mine wrote a paper which was published in the conventional literature where they did a simulation exercise pumping hot fluids through a suitable rock sequence rich with organic material, and were able to show how you could find pathways for the oil that was generated to rapidly accumulate in suitable reservoir rocks. And here's some of their computer simulations. You might say, but they got migration times of 1,000 years there. Well, wait a minute, how long is it since the flood? It's over 4,000 years. And many of the oil reservoirs are actually young. Some of the oil reservoirs, the oil has moved into it after the flood finished. We can demonstrate that from the rocks in which the oils have been found. This hydrothermal oil generation process is valid-based because it is backed by a lot of other observational experimental evidence. We know, for example, that oil can be generated from algal sludge by application of hot water. There's a commercial plant in the Pacific Northwest that's doing that today, producing biodiesel. Oil can be generated from sewage by the application of hot water. Oil can be generated from coals commercially. It was done in South Africa during the apartheid era when we cut off the oil supplies to them. They had plenty of coal, so they just generated oil from coal in commercial plants called Sasol plants. And oil can be generated from animal waste by the application of hot water. There's several commercial plants that are doing that here in the United States. All the meat waste from abattoirs, they can just mush it all up and apply heat to it, and they can get oils from that. So all you need to add hot water to a sauce, and lo and behold, you get plenty of oil and gas to do your cooking. So this hydrothermal oil generation model is totally feasible within the global cataclysmic flood and since. The organic material was buried rapidly by the raging floodwaters in sedimentary rock layers, such as coal beds, or otherwise dispersed. And these bed sequences included volcanic rocks. The deep burial raised temperatures, heating the groundwaters, the trapped waters in the sediments, which were supplemented by hot waters from volcanic activity. Even as the flood ended, the buried organic debris was transformed into coal in some instances, then by further heat and hot fluids, rapidly generated oil from it. And also the dispersed organic matter in the sedimentary layers deposited during the flood would also be generated by the heat and hot water, and that would rapidly migrate into reservoir rocks in trap structures. The oil and gas were thus generated within years and migrated within years to centuries, so that some oil fields continue to get added to even to the present. Remember what we said about the coal? Pre-flood land vegetation and forests floating on the ocean surface were progressively and catastrophically destroyed and then buried rapidly in sedimentary rock layers sequences with volcanic ash, sometimes with those vertical, rootless, polystrate tree stumps, and indicating that rapid burial. Increasing temperatures with deeper burial and hot waters from volcanoes and hot trap waters that were acidic from the volcanic activity turned the volcanic ash to clay, which catalysed the rapid transformation of the beds of plant debris into coal within months. Some of this buried organic debris was also not only transformed into coal, but by heat and hot water rapidly generated petroleum from them, and also petroleum was generated by the heat and hot water from dispersed organic matter in sedimentary rocks. And these rapidly migrated into reservoir rocks and trap structures. And as I said a moment ago, the oil and gas were thus generated within years and migrated within years to centuries, so that some oil fields continue to get added to even to the present time. So there's no mystery about coal and oil. They don't require millions of years to form. The flood is a sufficient explanation to give us the oil and gas, and the coal, oil and gas today that we have. And I might add as I close, to me it's a great picture of our God, that even in judgment, God was being merciful to provide us resources that we could use in the world after the flood. Isn't that a beautiful picture of God? Even in judgment, he exercised grace and mercy. Thank you so much. It's been great to share this with you tonight.